Hi, Philosophy 101 class. I'm pretty excited. Today we are going to finish talking about metaethics, and we're going to start talking about applied ethics. As I mentioned in one of our prior videos, you all wanted to talk about the COVID-19 situation, so I have endeavored to integrate examples of what we're dealing with right now uh, into our normative ethics conversation. It's kind of hard to get to it on a meta-ethical level, but maybe you'll see some spots where you can apply it and think it's relevant, and we can definitely discuss that and talk about that. Um, your final short answer response will be on the subject matter we've covered in these last two lectures. So with that said, let's get started. So I left off explaining that metaethics largely asks, are there such things as moral properties? And what do we mean with our moral claims, our moral utterances? So what we're looking at right here are two of the main branches of metaethics, two different views you can take. Moral realism is where we're going to start. Probably most people have moral realist intuitions, which is just to say that most of you probably hold that moral utterances, claims such as it's wrong to kill, report mind-independent facts. And what this means is not facts about any person or group's subjective opinion. So if you made a moral utterance that reported a mind-independent fact, you would be reporting a fact about the world that doesn't depend on what people personally think or feel. So it's always wrong to kill, or it's always good to take care of your children. It's always good to help the poor. These sorts of things it's always wrong to kick puppies, right? These utterances appear to report mind-independent facts about the world, that don't have anything to do with my opinion. If I thought kicking puppies was great and you said to me, hey, kicking puppies is wrong, you would be not reporting whether or not I like kicking puppies. You would be reporting a fact about the world, that puppies somehow have don't-kickedness in them. Or there is a rule written in the universe that says kicking puppies is wrong. It's not a matter of opinion. So that's what we mean by mind-independent facts, about objective features of the world. And full disclosure, a lot of this I just rewrote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as well as the Wikipedia page. So if this looks familiar to anyone else watching, I hopefully you don't count that as plagiarism. Because yeah, I just it says it straightforward, and we're going to unpack this. So mind-independent facts, objective features about the world. This is moral realism. A lot of religious people are going to have a moral realist intuition, which is to say that, when God says something's wrong, it is a fact. When he says not to do something, he or she says not to do something, they mean, right, because it's wrong, that's a fact about the world. What you personally think doesn't matter. Whether or not you want to kick puppies doesn't matter. But largely, we're not going to be looking at religious theories. Most philosophers and ethicists do not. And also, one's religion shouldn't dictate what one's normative ethical approach is. Historically, it hasn't. People have lots of different approaches regardless of their religious position. But moral realism is just the position that morals are real things, right? They're properties out in the world. They're facts. And what you think about them doesn't matter. So there are some subcategories to moral realisms that I've listed here. Ethical naturalism holds that there are objective moral properties and that these properties are reducible or stand in some metaphysical relationship, such as supervenience, to non-ethical properties. Guys, supervenience is a really hard concept. It means that one thing has the power to give a quality to something else. This is just an example. of the relation that it could have. It doesn't have to be a relationship of supervenience. And because you're a 101 class, and because supervenience is such a hard, let me get rid of this, such a hard word and such a hard concept, I'm just going to try to summarize this not using the concept of supervenience. Ethical naturalism is much better summed up by the idea that we have empirical knowledge of moral truths. And even if we don't have the empirical knowledge, the idea is that ethical properties are the same as any other natural property, right? They're the same as the length of something or the mass of something. We would go about knowing about ethical properties by investigating the world somehow, right? So this is what naturalist in this context means. It doesn't mean that what is natural is good. That is a serious error that a lot of people make when they start looking at metaethics. Naturalism is not the position that, oh, because it's natural, it's good. It's the position that ethical properties, because it's a type of moral realism, they exist, and they are receptive to investigation the same way scientific facts are. We would go out into the world and find about them empirically, through study, through experience, through investigation. Now, ethical naturalism is going to have some problems if moral properties are the same as other scientific properties. Why do we have so much disagreement about them, right? We don't have this kind of disagreement about 2 plus 2. We're all like, for the most part, we agree that equals 4. Additionally, with scientific facts, global warming, for example, we might have some disagreement for a while, but pretty quickly, through studying, climate science, we come to something like consensus. Most scientists come to agreement. So we have an interesting problem with ethical naturalism already. If we come by these through empirical study, why is there so much disagreement? Why can't we find out more facts about them? How exactly would we go about studying them? These are just some questions for ethical naturalism. Then there's ethical non-naturalism, which say that goodness, right, there are objective and irreducible moral properties, right? These are all going to have that in common because they're all types of moral realism. And the example we've been given here is the property of goodness. And then non-natural is going to say we have an intuitive or otherwise a priori awareness of moral properties and moral truths. So under this view, the moral properties that these moral realists assert exist, we cannot study empirically. We can't get to them the same way we get at scientific facts, or the same way we get at mathematical facts. Maybe some mathematical facts, depending on your view of that. But anyway, we have an intuitive sense. So this is the big difference between naturalism and non-naturalism. Naturalism is going to hold that, yes, there are moral facts, and we know about them empirically, and non-naturalism is going to say, what? You can't study moral properties. You can't go out and get a microscope and look at that. You just have an a priori intuitive awareness of these moral truths. And again, for the non-naturalist, we're going to have a lot of the same problems. Why is there such disagreement? If we're all given this intuitive sense of right and wrong, why is it that we disagree so strongly across different cultures and across different times, and even within cultures, we disagree strongly? If we do have an intuitive awareness of a very real property in the world, there shouldn't be this kind of disagreement. We should have pretty much consensus on it, right? That, or a lot of people have really broken intuitive senses, and that's maybe something you might be inclined to say, but it certainly doesn't work in favor of the idea that non-naturalism is true. Again, the fact of disagreement is a significant problem for ethical non-naturalism. It's also, both these views are pretty absolutist, right? These moral facts just exist out there. We don't know whether they exist, naturally or non-naturally, whether we can investigate them or not, but these brute facts exist. They exist mind independently. If no human being ever existed, these moral facts would still exist. They're not a matter of opinion. Context doesn't matter, situation doesn't matter, none of that matters. These facts exist. That seems a little too absolutist to me, and maybe it seems a little too absolutist to you. If that's the case, you might have an intuition like moral relativism. Moral relativism is going to say, okay, there are objective moral facts, but they differ culture to culture and across time. A lot of people have this naive view, so I want to take a moment to talk about it. This view is not a descriptive claim. It's obviously true. It's just obviously descriptively true that different cultures do indeed have different values. This is a different position entirely. This is almost an anthropological position, right? This position holds that there are objective moral facts, and those moral facts differ culture to culture and across time. So it's not the observation that different cultures have different values. It's saying that there is a fact in the world, a moral fact in the world, and it's different depending on the culture you're in and the time period you're in, right? It's relative to it. So there is an objective nature to this position, right? I'm going to get rid of this descriptive claim because it's kind of messing me up. This view has some significant problems, and I do want to take some time to explore them because most people have some moral relativistic inclinations. This is kind of a naive thing, and it seems very nice because it seems accepting, right? It seems accepting of other cultures and other views and non-discriminatory, and I get the appeal of it, but there are some serious problems for this. So I'm going to pause this recording and queue up my favorite piece on this, which I will link in the video description as well as on my on our canvas. So what we have in front of us is a marked up PDF of Mary Migdaly's Trying Out One's New Sword. We've got her last name there, if you want to know how to spell it, Mary Migdaly. It starts out with the idea that all of us are, more or less, in trouble today about trying to understand cultures strange to us. We are constantly of alien customs. We see changes in our lifetime which would have astonished our parents. She goes on to say, I want to discuss here one very short way of dealing with this difficulty, a drastic way which people now theoretically favor. It consists simply in denying that we can ever understand any culture except our own well enough to make judgments about it. This is to say, I look at a different culture, and I say, well, they have different values, and what's right for them is just right for them. What she's describing here is moral relativism, right? Those who recommend this hold that the world is sharply divided into separate societies, sealed units, each with its own system of thought. They feel that the respect and tolerance due from one system to another forbids us to ever take up a critical position to any other culture. Moral judgment, they suggest, is a kind of coinage, valid only in its country of origin. She's being a bit sassy here. She calls this position moral isolationism. But this is a really fantastic piece because she goes on to not discuss something obvious like female genital mutilation, but an ancient samurai custom of trying out one's new sword on a random wayfarer. That's how you can know your sword was good, I guess, in the culture and at the time she's describing. I don't want to go too much into this paper. I'll provide it if you want to read it. It's only a few pages long, and it's notated by someone who is not me. This is just the version I found. So I'll link that. But she specifically says she doesn't want to talk about, female genital mutilation or something like the Chinese Cultural Revolution, both of which were very, very salient at the time. Instead, she picks a neutral thing to discuss and points out some problems with relativism. So I'm going to tab back to our Word document so we can just talk about those. But if you want a further explanation of these problems, I would strongly suggest trying out One's New Sword by Mary Migdally. It's wonderful. Okay, so a huge problem with this is this. Right? This would mean Nazis were right. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is, well, Nazi culture had different views and different values. And if there are objective moral facts, and they just are whatever a culture is, and we're incapable of criticizing, the Nazis were doing the right thing. It was. And, Nazis are quite a bombastic example. But this means that moral progress moral progress is impossible. So if you hold the position that you can't judge another culture or your own culture at a different time period, right? If you see them as these sealed things, these sealed units, as Mary Magdalene describes, then you've got this serious problem where any change, what that culture is doing is just right. It's right for them. Those are objective moral facts. Remember, this is a kind of moral realism. And what's right for that culture is right for that culture. We need to be able to criticize these sorts of things. To take this position is to say something like, when America had slavery, and then we had a civil war about it, that doesn't represent moral progress, because it was a different culture and it was a different time and people had different views. This is a pretty untenable position. It becomes pretty apparent very quickly that we don't want to hold this position. We want to be able to say no. If there are moral facts, there's a fact of the matter about America before and after slavery, and it was better after slavery. Or without slavery. Getting rid of slavery was a good thing. We want to be able to say that, and moral relativism, or cultural isolationism, as Mary Migdally calls it, it prohibits us from saying that, because it's just the position that there are objective moral facts and they differ culture to culture and across time. So I want you all to really let that sink in for a minute, what it would mean for us to not be able to judge other cultures or our own at different times. Just because we're not a part of something doesn't mean we can't judge it. If we're going to say that there are moral facts and that our moral utterances report these mind-independent facts, this is not the way out of the problems of naturalism and non-naturalism. Okay. That's all I really have to say about realism. I will disclose I am not a moral realist. I kind of wish I were, because it is very intuitive, right? It would be nice to say, no, there are moral facts, and it's just our job to find them. I am a kind of moral anti-realist. There are lots of different types of moral anti-realists. We only have two here, but they represent the two very different ways to take on the language question of metaethics. So briefly, very briefly, moral anti-realism holds that there are no moral facts or properties. They simply do not exist. So, excuse me. We have this problem of, well, what then right? So we have all this moral language. We make all these moral claims, right? It's wrong to kick puppies. Let's keep using that one. Exclamation point on the end. It's wrong to kick puppies. Okay, so what exactly do we mean when we make a moral claim like it's wrong to kick puppies? Well, error theory is a kind of anti-realism. It's going to say that this does express a proposition. When somebody says it's wrong to kick puppies, they are trying to report an objective fact about the world. It's just these properties don't exist. We talked briefly about this in the last video. Wrongness does not exist. So that proposition is simply false. So, and again, just lifted from either the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the wiki page, both the statement murder is morally wrong and the statement murder is morally permissible are false according to this error theory. I'm going to expound on this a bit further. I talked about this briefly in my last video, but effectively, if you have a statement like unicorns are dope. I don't know. I think they would be. So if you have a statement like this, this is going to be false because unicorns do not exist, right? Just like wrongness does not exist. But also the statement nobody's ever said unicorns are not dope, is going to be false. Because, again, unicorns simply do not refer to anything. So both of these claims are trying to say something about the world. But because unicorns are not a thing in the world, they're both false. Likewise, oh no, what just happened there? Okay. Likewise, kicking puppies is wrong is going to be false because wrongness does not refer to anything. It doesn't pick out anything in the world, right? And I say permissible because maybe you don't want to kick puppies, so I'm not going to say it's right, like you have to go out and kick puppies. But it would be okay if you wanted to. This is also going to be false. This is why this is called error theory, right? So it allows for the fact that when we try to report on some sort of moral claim, we are trying to report on something in the world, right? So it also holds that moral utterances report mind-independent facts. It just holds that those facts are all false because these properties simply do not exist. So I like this view quite a bit. There are some significant problems with it. It is a bit like taking your ball and going home. Like, I don't want to play anymore. It's hard for me to argue against this one because it is my own position. But the best I can do is to say that usually when we make statements like unicorns are dope, we are contributing to our knowledge of the world, right? Well, let's change it to something else. I really like bicycling, so let's change it to bikes are dope. Right? When I say this, I'm contributing to our knowledge of bikes. Whereas when I say something like kicking puppies is wrong, that doesn't actually seem to give us a better understanding of it. So it seems to lack some descriptive qualities. I'll try to get back to you with some better arguments against error theory. It did not occur to me that I was giving you arguments against every view except my own view. My bad. But I struggle with it because it is a bit like taking your ball and going home. It's quitting the game. It's just saying, okay, yeah, sure. These statements are saying what they seem to be saying. Uh, they're claiming something about the world, but it's just all wrong. We're all just, attempting to refer and failing to. So it also intuitively doesn't feel right. These seem to be differently false, just like with Russell. So let's move on before I embarrass myself further. We have Emotivism. This is a completely different view. Emotivism also holds that there are no moral facts or properties, right? Because it's kind of anti-realism. But it says that ethical sentences, or what I've been calling moral utterances, serve merely to express emotions, right? Ethical sentences are expressions of approval or disapproval, not assertions, right? So error theory holds that their assertions about the world, they're just all wrong. Emotivism is a kind of non-cognitivism. It means that we cannot evaluate these statements as true or false. Kicking puppies is wrong is very much just like saying, kicking puppies, yuck. I don't want to do that. I don't like that, right? So it's an expression of personal approval or disapproval. There's still no fact of the matter about it, right? Because there simply are no moral facts or properties. I guess there is a fact of the matter about error theory, and it's that they're all false. But they simply don't express the sort of thing which is able to be evaluated in terms of true or false. Instead, our moral sentences are just a statement of disapproval. Boo on killing, right? Or to keep my example, boo to kicking. Now, I don't like this view because I see people having moral arguments, and that doesn't seem to be mere booing. When people make moral claims, they do seem to be attempting to describe reality. We work really hard to come to our moral positions, and something like yum, ice cream, or if you're lactose intolerant, our moral utterances seem personally to me to have a lot more gravity than this, than just a preference, just a strong approval or disapproval. There are views other than emotivism, but we're also going to have some of the same problems with emotivism that we did with our philosophy of language, in that these don't seem to embed very. So I think this would be easier to explain with the problem in front of us. We discussed this problem a little bit when we discussed Fraga. It's actually called the Fraga-Geach problem. It's developed from Fraga's writings, which is why it was so important to understand the four puzzles of language that we talked about. So I'm just going to pull up the Wikipedia page so we can look at this problem a little bit. This position contends that it's wrong to get your little brother to tell lies can be deduced from two premises by modus ponens. So if we say it's wrong to tell lies, or our first premise is it's wrong to tell lies. Our second premise is if it's wrong to tell lies, then it's wrong to get your little brother to tell lies. Therefore, it's wrong to get your little brother to tell lies, right? If we grant these two, this conclusion is unavoidable. It's necessary. So the problem is, this first position is just going to be like, I feel yuck about telling lies, right? But then when we embed it in this claim right here, if it's wrong to tell lies, then it's wrong to get your little brother to tell lies. We can't get yuck little brother telling lies, right? It might just be yuck me telling lies, right? Uh, I think rather than me trying to explain this any further, I'm just going to highlight this next bit and we can read it along together. In the second statement, the expressivist account appears to fail in that the speaker is asserting the hypothetical premise is expressing no moral position toward lying, condemnatory nor otherwise. Right? So let's get back and look at this right here. Emotivism holds that ethical sentences merely express emotions. Ethical sentences express approval or disapproval, not assertions, right? Not facts of the matter. So if you feel like you're just approving or disapproving, it's not clear that this kind of moral language can be made sense of. Why would yuck for me mean yuck for anyone else? Why would we be able to deduce this? And I'm going to refer to this a bit further just conversationally because, again, you guys are a 101 class, so I don't expect you to be able to do this high level of logic. But essentially, uh, I can say, yum, ice cream, and you can say yuck ice cream, and we're not in disagreement because we're just expressing our personal opinions of these things. So yum ice cream and yuck ice cream can totally coexist perfectly. But it seems that something like it's wrong to kick puppies and it's morally permissible to kick puppies, there's a disagreement there. We're making two different claims that are in contention. We're not just expressing our personal preferences. We're expressing something larger than that. We seem to be trying to claim something about the world, which again is why I'm an error theorist, because it seems like moral disagreement is a problem for non-cognitivist positions. Uh, when we disagree, we're doing more than just having a conversation about whether or not we personally approve of ice cream. We seem to be trying to describe something true about the world, or at least so I think. Um, so yes, that's a serious problem for emotivism. Hopefully this makes sense after I've edited that down because that was a real struggle. All right, let's move on. So having looked at moral realism, moral anti-realism, moral non-cognitivism, and cognitivism, and a couple other like subcategories of metaethics, I want to move on to normative ethics. Our metaethical positions are going to have some influence over what our normative ethical positions are, and I've largely left these blank so that you know that we're going to be making some notes in here. So hopefully you're prepared to make some notes. We're only going to be looking at really two normative ethical positions. There are other normative ethical positions, but these are the two major contenders. I've seen a lot of virtue theorists around, but unfortunately, uh, life happens and pandemics strike, and I don't get as much time to teach all this stuff as I would like to. So, as much as I would like to include Aristotelian virtue ethics, um, it's a different sort of ethical system. These two ethical systems both try to tell you what you should do in certain situations, whereas Aristotelian virtue ethics seeks to tell you uh, how to be a better person yourself. So some people refer to these positions as other facing, meaning they tell you how you should treat others. Oh, why did my computer just do that? They tell you how to treat others. Whereas virtue ethics tells you what kind of person you should be and hopes that your treatment of others falls out of that. So it is a bit difficult to include in a conversation about these two positions. And we're running low on time, and I don't want to overwhelm you guys. So this is where we're going to try to talk about our current situation some. But first, we need an understanding of these positions. For the most part, we're going to be talking about these as moral realists. We're going to discuss right and wrong as though there is some fact of the matter about them. Uh, Metaethics didn't come along until after these two positions developed, and I think that's a real tragedy. But we'll see. We'll see. Again, this is why error theory is kind of like taking your ball and going home, because what do these positions even mean if you're an error theorist? So the first thing to know about consequentialism, oh my goodness, and utilitarianism is that consequentialism was made by Jeremy Bentham. Um, let's capitalize that. That would be nice. And utilitarianism was made by John Stuart Mill. So we've got these two guys. Bentham comes before Mill. Mill attempted to fix some problems with consequentialism. I'm just going to stop saying that. Consequentialism says effectively that the right thing to do is what causes the most pleasure. Pretty straightforward, right? That's the good is identical to the pleasurable. Now, some of you might already be objecting to this. This should be obviously a bit problematic. This doesn't distinguish between kinds of pleasure, right? So a really funny example of this is during my undergraduate career, a friend of mine wanted to cheat on his girlfriend. And he was like, look, it's pleasurable for me. It'll be pleasurable for the girl I cheat with. And if my girlfriend never finds out, it won't cause her any harm. It won't cause her displeasure. So according to Jeremy Bentham, I should do it. And he's not necessarily wrong, because this doesn't account for the fact that you might get a little bit of pleasure out of hooking up with, a girl who's not your girlfriend, and she might get a little bit of pleasure out of that. But the harm you do in lying and betraying somebody's trust is greatly outweighs um, the any pleasure you might get. So I don't know if that's the best example. It's one that comes from my life, but there's some serious problems with Bentham. Like what's most pleasurable? That's it's very hard to say. What kind of pleasure, right? Is it eating a cheesecake or is it attending the opera? And this is where John Stuart Mill is going to come in, and he's going to say. He's going to say, look, there are different kinds of pleasures. There are different degrees of pleasure. Let's instead talk about happiness or uh, well-being. And he says, the joy you get from writing a novel or attending a concert, not like a rock concert. John Stuart Mill was not around then, but like, an orchestral concert or something like that. These are higher pleasures. Whereas the pleasure from eating a cheesecake or having an affair is a lower pleasure. So he distinguished between types of pleasure and instead said, let's just promote general happiness and well-being with a specific focus on, the higher pleasures, recognizing that something like, okay, maybe maybe eating a cheesecake is one unit of pleasure. Uh, maybe, I don't know. Right, and maybe seeing an amazing painting is 20 units of pleasure. So I love how I spelled affair. Having an affair uh, is a lower. And what do I mean by significant harm, right? This is a, let's change our language. It has the potential to cause a higher kind of harm. The lower pleasure of having an affair does not justify the very, very deep, higher kind of harm of losing a relationship, maybe breaking up a family, that sort of thing. This is a higher kind of harm. So that's largely Mill's contribution, and he's going to call his theory utilitarianism, which is much easier for me to say. The thing about both these views, why don't you just let me go back? Okay, I don't know why it won't let me do that. I'm going to pause this and fix that. Eureka! I have fixed it. So, what these two views have in common is that they both look at the outcomes of an action. So, if you're considering doing something, let's say you're considering stealing. You'd ask yourself, how much suffering? You can ask yourself, how much suffering would stealing this, item, this thing, cause? And you're going to ask yourself, that's so strange. I have no idea what my computer is even doing. And how much happiness will stealing this thing bring me? We're just looking at outcomes. And if it brings more happiness than suffering, then you should steal the thing. So it's not hard to imagine a scenario where we do this kind of moral calculation. Let's say that instead of stealing a thing, you're stealing, say you're stealing bread to feed your family. So in that case, a lot. And let's say that, you're stealing the bread from a very wealthy person. So not much. That person had lots of bread. Wow. That person had lots of bread, right? So it's not hard to imagine that we could say stealing would be the right thing to do under a utilitarian consequentialist view, because it looks at outcomes. This generates more happiness than suffering, so you should steal the thing. Of course you should steal the thing to feed your family. This has some problems, though. So let's take a look at the problems with outcome-based ethical systems. So first of all, how the fuck are we figuring out these units of happiness? What? So I don't know about you, but John Stuart Mill's idea of, seeing amazing paintings seems kind of bougie. Like, maybe I just want to eat cheesecake. It seems kind of arbitrary, right? It's a bit elitist. I don't know that I buy into this idea that eating a cheesecake is a lower kind of pleasure than seeing an amazing painting. Maybe you do, though. Um, so we also need to say, how are we figuring out the consequences? How far down the line, right? So maybe I steal this bread and feed my family, but my son is Hitler, right? Um, we can't necessarily figure out these consequences. Um, Immediately, it's going to be very, very difficult. And a huge criticism of utilitarianism is that it asks too much. And we're going to talk about the different ways an ethical theory can ask too much. But this asks us to calculate something we cannot possibly figure out. Um, I'm sure most of you have heard of like the butterfly effect or something, and I don't subscribe to a view that tiny actions can have direct, far-reaching consequences like that. But absolutely, there are unintended, unanticipated consequences to our actions all the time. Um, and this is a time when we can actually talk about our actions with regard to coronavirus for a minute. So I want to pause for a second. Not the video, but pause our regular lecture. And instead of talking about families stealing bread and this sort of ridiculous thing, we can instead talk about some of the unintended consequences that our actions have had. So as many of you know, the price of oil went into the negatives. This is largely because of the stay-at-home orders or the shelter-in-place orders that have been sent around America in various states. It changes state by state. So nobody anticipated this consequence. Nobody saw our economy effectively crashing um, as a consequence of a very well-intentioned action. So if we were being utilitarians about it, we could say now maybe that was the wrong thing to do. Maybe it was wrong to shut everything down because people have lost their jobs, people are unable to pay bills, people are out of work. You guys are having to listen to these lengthy lectures at home. My 102 class is incredibly confused, and I feel terrible about that, and I don't know how to fix it. Our actions have these far-reaching consequences, and we're not always able to figure them out, even in the near future. But we can look at this a different way. If we're being utilitarians about this, maybe we would say, well, no, you know, something like that. Dying is normal. People are going to die anyway. Mostly the. I hope this isn't offending anyone. This is not my position. This is just one way to look at what's going on right now. The right, you might say something like this: no, don't close everything down. Let a few people die. Dying is normal. People were going to die anyway because it's mostly the elderly dying. The consequences of shutting everything down is that more people suffer than if we just let this run its course. You could argue this. You could take this position if you were being utilitarian about things. Namely because shutting everything down and accidentally crashing the economy affects everyone negatively. And, if you think you can calculate these units of happiness, maybe everyone suffering all together is far worse than a few people suffering briefly and dying, especially because it's mostly the elderly dying. You could definitely take this position. Interestingly, you could take an even longer view of it. Well, actually, before I go on with that, I want to say, you know, speaking of consequences, we don't know that the consequences would have been better or worse. This theory asks us to calculate something we cannot possibly figure out. Would it have been worse if a lot of people got sick and overwhelmed hospitals? Or would it have been like ripping a Band-Aid off? We can't know. This is a serious problem for this theory. This is not just a problem for our behavior right now. This is a problem for theories that are only interested in outcomes, is that we cannot possibly calculate outcomes. There might be a point in the future where we can better anticipate outcomes, but we certainly can't right now. And, on a personal note, with regard to coronavirus, we certainly can't figure out outcomes if we act hastily and out of fear. That's not going to be a reliable method of figuring out the consequences ever. Patience is and careful thought is always advisable. Maybe we could have anticipated the economy shutting down if we shut the economy down, and the consequences we're seeing now, had we taken a bit more time with this, and been a bit more patient with this. I don't know. Maybe more people would have died. I don't know. This is the whole point I'm trying to make, is we really just can't know. That sounds awful, but we really just can't know. I've gotten lazy about that, sorry. This is a serious problem for utilitarianism, and it's a serious problem for the way we're dealing with this crisis right now. Is we're trying to anticipate futures that we don't have the capacity to anticipate, and we're basing our actions largely off of that. So let's move on. How far down the line can we go, right? Because this argument doesn't go very far down the line, right? It doesn't look very far into the future. What about an argument that went something like, I've seen this argument out in the wild, that it's quite good that we've shut everything down because our carbon emissions have actually plummeted. And, people are walking around more, riding bicycles more. We've found ourselves in a much less consumeristic society. And very far down the line, this might actually teach us how to behave in order to fix some significant problems like global warming. Right? There have been jellyfish spotted in Venice, in the canals, which have cleared up because nobody's in them. The air pollution in both China and Los Angeles is way down because people aren't driving as much. These are all positives. We've also saved some lives, and these are all positives, right? So you could argue from a utilitarian perspective, if you're taking a very, very, very long view, that actually it's good that we crashed the economy because it's solving a lot of environmental problems and we're saving lives. So again, we're right back to we really just can't know. So hopefully that helps illustrate this problem for utilitarianism. But we're not yet done yet. It has some other problems. So our good friend Derek Parfit, I can spell his name correctly, has a thought, yeah, not necessarily a thought experiment, but an objection called the, sometimes it's called the mirror addition paradox sometimes. I don't like this so much because it's not a formal mathematical paradox, so I'm going to be referring to it as the repugnant conclusion. But I've queued this up for us, and we're going to talk about it. So let's scroll down a bit. So Derek Parfit's going to ask us to consider the 4 populations depicted below. So we have population A. Let's imagine this is just a world full of people. We have population A plus, we have population B minus, and we have population B. So these are different worlds, right? If it helps you to imagine them on different planets or in alternate universes, go crazy. But these are just all the people that exist, right? And there are 4 different versions that we're going to be considering. So consider the 4 populations depicted in the following diagram. A plus, B minus, and B. Each bar represents a distinct group of people, with the group's size represented by the bar's width, right? So A is a smaller group of people than B, right? Maybe there are 10 people in A, and there are 20 people in B. So, and the happiness of each group is the height, right? So we can see that A has as many people right here who are as happy as A plus, and then A plus has 10 more people, let's say. Let's just say this is 10, 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 and this is 20, just to give us some even numbers to work with so we can think of it, right? So our total population here is 20, our total population here is 20, and our total population here is 20. The height is just the happiness, right? Unlike A and B, A plus and B minus are complex populations, each comprising 2 distinct groups of people, right? So we can see that A, everybody is equally happy. But in A plus, some people are very happy and some people are not so happy. 10 people are super happy and 10 people are not so happy. In B, everybody is equally happy. And in B here, everybody is equally happy, right? So how do these populations compare in value? Parfit observes that A plus seems no worse than A under utilitarianism, right? Because you have the same number of people being happy, and then you've just got some extra people who aren't suffering, but they're not happy either, right? This is because the people in A are no worse off in A plus, while the addition of the people who exist in A plus are better off in A plus compared to A, if it's stipulated that their lives are good enough that living is better than non-existing. So quite often in philosophy we refer to this as lives barely worth living, right? These people are not happy. They're not stoked. They're not going out on adventures. They're not falling in love. They're not going to college. Their lives are barely worth living. They're just better than not existing at all. Just above suicide, right? So next, Parfit suggests that if B minus seems better than A plus, this is because B minus has a greater total average happiness than A plus, right? And certainly we would say, okay, yeah, that's better. Utilitarianism is just looking at happiness. It's just looking at outcomes. So we've got a whole bunch of people very happy. We've got same number of people very happy, and then we've got some other people who are better off existing than not, and then we've got B minus, which is better than A plus. Obviously, this has twice as many people living better lives than barely worth living, but not quite as good as the people in A plus, right? I don't know if you guys can see that, but B is a bit lower. B minus is a bit lower than A plus or A, right? So you add these two together, and there are 20 people who are living pretty decent lives. They're not super stoked like the A people, but they're pretty good lives, right? So it has a greater total average happiness than A plus. Then he notes that B seems equally as good as B minus, right? These aren't really different, right? As the only difference between B minus and B is that the two groups in B are merged from one group into B. All they've done is gotten rid of this. It's the same population, essentially. They're living the same kind of lives. There's no trick here. These are level. Together, these three comparisons entail that B is better than A, right? Because we agreed that A plus was better than A, and we agreed that B minus was better than A plus, and we agreed that B was the same as B minus. Therefore, B is better than A. However, Parfit observes that when we directly compare A, a population with a high average happiness, and B, a population with lower average happiness, but more total happiness because of its larger population. What? Right when I was on a roll, Peter got weird. Okay. Where were we? Okay. But more total happiness because of its larger population. It may seem that B can be worse than A. Right? These people's lives aren't great. The people in A are riding jet skis, or whatever your fantasy is. The people in B have a little bit of happiness, but they're not as happy. They're not riding jet skis, right? So nobody is riding jet skis in B. Jet skis don't even exist. Maybe this is 100 years ago or something. I don't know. But this population, nobody is as happy as any of the people in A. So thus, there is a paradox. The followingly intuitively plausible claims are jointly compatible, which means that two incompatible claims appear to be compatible. That A plus is no worse than A, that B minus is better than A plus, which we all agreed to, that B minus is equally as good as B, which we all agreed to, and that B can be worse than A. That's where the paradox comes in. Because a lot of people are going to want to say, well, no, just adding more people doesn't make it a better world. The real problem is we could keep going with this, right? If we made a C group that contained 30 people and their happiness level was down here, and then we made a D group with 40 people, but their happiness was all just barely worth living, that's going to be, we're going to follow that same logic where, well, if all we're doing is trying to make as much happiness as possible, then just having more people by default gets us to there. It's not necessarily a matter of having more happiness. That seems problematic. This is a very difficult concept to understand, but we'll go through it one more time. So, from the top, not using all this stuff right here, utilitarianism just cares about creating as much happiness as possible. It appears that if we have 100 people living lives barely worth living, that's, according to utilitarianism, better than only having 10 people living the best lives possible. I don't necessarily agree with that. This is really just going to depend on your personal intuitions, whether or not you would rather be a person born into world A, or whether or not you'd rather be a person born into, world D, way down here, where there are 100 people living lives barely worth living. And it gets worse, because imagine now that there are 1,000 people living lives barely worth living, right? Just better than not existing. Utilitarianism is going to tell us that that is better than 10 people living great lives, because overall, there's more happiness. The problem with utilitarianism that I have is along these same lines. It treats us all as though we're just bags of happiness. We're all equal bags of happiness. So it requires us to be impartial, and that sounds great because it's very fair. We want to be impartial, right? We want to say everybody's happiness counts equally. Nobody is more important than anybody else, although there is a concept called the utility monster, which I would be happy to share with anyone who's curious, that gives a utilitarian argument for treating people unequally. But anyway, theoretically, if somebody experienced greater happiness than other people, then everybody should just try to make them happy, right? Because that's a way of increasing net happiness. But this theory treats us all as though we are just bags of happiness. And that's a significant problem. But let's talk about this impartiality a bit more, because it raises another problem. So what is it to be impartial? All right? This means your happiness is not the only happiness that matters. We need this in order for utilitarianism to make any kind of sense, right? Otherwise, you're just going to go around doing what's good for you and not worrying about the consequences, and that's not an ethical theory at all. Well, maybe it's egoism, but it's not an ethical theory we're going to be looking at. So your happiness is not the only happiness that matters. Well, maybe we should just say happiness is just happiness, and suffering is just suffering. It's not clear that this is good. This sounds good. It sounds fair, but it's not clear that it's good. This would demand that you give up all your excess money to other people who are suffering. It would demand that if you have children or family or partners or loved ones, friends, that you not treat them partially. That instead of buying a birthday present for your son, daughter, brother, sister, best friend, whatever, you donate that money to charity. And that might seem good. There are people who live their lives according to this. But it's not necessarily as intuitive as it initially seems. Uh, this means that if you had to choose between saving your child or your best friend and a random stranger, you should treat them equally, right? Because that random stranger is somebody's child or best friend as well. And it's not clear that human beings are meant to be impartial in this sort of way. So this is a pretty high-level critique, but I want you guys to consider it. I think it's also kind of salient right now to our current crisis. When we take this idea of impartiality and we consider Derek Parfit's repugnant conclusion, and evaluate exactly what's going on with COVID-19, it seems pretty clear that what we've done is we've created a world where we save everyone, right? We keep everyone alive. This is great. Well, not everyone, but we keep more people alive. This is great, but everyone's overall happiness has significantly gone down. right? Are we living in world D or C or B or whatever it would be? This is something worth considering. Do we want, is just having more people alive, living lives that aren't all that great, better than having a few people who are living fantastic lives? I'm not prescribing an attitude toward this. I'm not saying what we should do. This is just something we need to consider, again, when taking these sorts of actions. We have definitely acted impartially, right? Everyone counts equally. No one gets priority here. Everybody has to stay home uh, unless you're essential. So this is a really interesting view or lens to view this current crisis through. Because once you understand things like the repugnant conclusion and how that's a consequence of utilitarianism and why it might be a problem, you can really easily see that this sort of reasoning is being applied to the COVID-19 virus. More people alive is great, but overall happiness has significantly gone down. Um, this is what philosophy does. It asks these questions. Is this actually what we want? Was this our goal? And is this morally right? These are not insignificant problems. Okay, so with that said, let's move on to the last and final critique, which will bring us to deontology, our next view. So we're going to talk about something called, that I'm calling, the lone hiker thought experiment. This has lots of different names, but essentially it goes as follows. You are a doctor at a remote, you're a doctor at a remote hospital. You have 5 patients, all of whom need organ transplants as soon as possible to survive. Let's just say they are all the same blood type. It's a thought experiment. And a quick note on thought experiments, don't try to break them. A couple people tried to break the other thought experiments we had, and they were like, well, that would never happen. That's not a response that we like to thought experiments. We know this would never happen. So don't try to break it. Just go along with the thought experiments. These are givens. If you refuse to play the game, then you're just refusing to play the game. You're not actually responding to the thought experiment. So moving on. So you have 5 patients, all of whom need organ transplants as soon as possible to survive. A lone hiker comes into the oh, wow, that did not want to come out. Comes into the hospital with a treatable illness, right? This could be easily treated. I don't know, maybe not with antibiotics or something, because that would make him. Let's say he's bleeding to death, like he has a broken leg and he's bleeding to death, right? The hiker just so happens to be a perfect match for your 5 other patients. So if you do nothing, on his own, or let's say naturally, you'll have a donor for your 5 patients. So it's pretty clear where this goes from here, right? Do you let the hiker die in order to Do you let the hiker die in order to harvest his organs and save the lives of the 5 patients, or do you treat the hiker for his blood loss? We decided it was. So here's our thought experiment laid out. Do you let the hiker die, or in order to harvest his organs, save the lives of the 5 patients, or do you treat the hiker for his blood loss? Utilitarianism is going to say you need to let the hiker die. This is a 5-to-1, right? You could save 5 lives by letting 1 person die. That's significantly more happiness, right? Where we know we have to be impartial. The fact that we're a doctor and we took the Hippocratic Oath does not particularly matter. Happiness is happiness. Life is life. Everyone is equal. What do we do? Now, hopefully this makes you a little uncomfortable because you don't want to live in a society where if you're out for a hike, a doctor might just harvest your organs. It's horrible. That doesn't sound good. But utilitarianism demands it. And again, in this sense, it asks too much. So I said we would talk about a few different ways that it asks too much. And in this sense, utilitarianism asks us to do things that no one should be asked to do. And it possibly creates a world that nobody would want to live in. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I'd be very happy in a world where at any time, if my death would save 5 other people, I could just have my organs randomly harvested. That doesn't sound great to me, but that is the world that utilitarianism prescribes to us. This is the problem with treating people impartially like bags of happiness or like bags of utility, right? And this is another reason why impartiality is not necessarily as good as it seems. So the response to this is something called rule utilitarianism, where it acknowledges that people would be pretty unhappy. Overall happiness. We should go down a space. Right? Overall happiness in a world where you could have your organs randomly harvested would be pretty low. And it would be low exactly because it is a world in which you could have your organs, right? It would be low exactly because it is a world in which you could have your organs randomly harvested. So utilitarians are not dumb people. They're quite clever. Utilitarianism is an interesting theory, even though I just ripped on it for a good 40 minutes there. Utilitarians came up with something called rule. Where instead of evaluating each individual action, let's make this bold, instead of evaluating each individual action and asking whether or not happiness would increase or decrease, we say, what if we made a rule of this? Would that make people more or less happy? Would that increase or decrease happiness? Now, I tend to think rule utilitarianism does a pretty decent job of saving utilitarianism from a lot of these criticisms. Because if we scroll back up, we'll see that our first criticism, our first criticism is that John Stuart Mill is kind of bougie. But our first criticism, which is this like units of happiness and figuring out consequences and how far down the line we can go, all of this is solved by just making a rule that says, okay, well, in these circumstances, these tend to be the consequences, and these the long-term outcomes. Rural utilitarianism solves some of these things. It also doesn't ask us to calculate on the fly units of happiness. right? So this problem we've encountered with COVID-19, if we made a rule like when there is a deadly disease, we shut down everything, we would have time to evaluate that in advance. We wouldn't have to address these things just as they come to us in every specific situation, right? Or maybe we could say, it's good for global warming and it'll solve other problems. Or no, don't in the long term because it tends to destroy the economy. We'd be able to make these rules that we could apply long term instead of asking us to calculate this craziness on the fly without much warning. It doesn't really solve Derek Parfit's repugnant conclusion, which may be why I think that's such a strong criticism of it. But it allows us a kind of impartiality because we're just making a rule. We don't end up with these weird situations where we end up having to kill people in spite of being a doctor, because that world would be a very unhappy world. So it solves some problems, but not all. And I'm not going to tell you all of them that it solves because your short answer might have something to do with this. But ruled utilitarianism, let's fill this out, looks at what outcomes would be if a rule were put in place. For example, harvest so it looks at outcomes if a rule were put in place. For example, harvest organs if it would save more lives than it costs. And then asks if that rule would create a happier society. So this concludes what we're going to say about utilitarianism. I know this is a very long video, so if you wanted to pause, now would probably be a good time to pause. And we'll come back and look at the other view, which is deontology. It's going to have a lot to do with rules, so there's a little teaser for you. So deontology, or Kantianism, is kind of the exact opposite of utilitarianism. This view only looks at intentions. Let me get rid of this bold. So this view only looks at intentions. It simply, not dimply, goodness gracious, does not care about outcomes. So Kant is famous for saying there is no good but goodwill, which is to say the good, right, what is good in the world, so if I see a little old lady crossing the street and I with all her groceries, and I go to help her, but she thinks I'm a robber trying to steal her groceries and has a heart attack, the outcome doesn't matter. Only my goodwill. I did the right thing trying to help that little old lady cross the street. I had goodwill. I had good intentions. It's a pretty straightforward example, actually. I'm sad I didn't think of that sooner. So Kant came to this view in spite of being an extremely religious person, because he thought that morals were objective, right? He was a moral realist, and he thought that we could look at the world and discover what was good and bad, that these were facts about reality. He noticed that if you ask different people about what their religion said was right or wrong, that you'd get a whole lot of different views. He wanted to ground morality in reality. So he came up with this idea of deontology, but he also came up with some rules. We're not going to go over all of the rules, but we are going to talk specifically about universalizability. So, universalizability says, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Kant was not known for his clear writing. He had some other methods of discovering what is good in the world, or to help us discover what is good in the world. But this is probably the easiest of them and most famous to understand. So let's unpack this. By maxim here, he just means rule or law. So when you're trying to figure out what you should do, you should act only according to that rule by which you can at the same time will, want, wish, desire, that it should become universal law. This last bit is also hard. What he's saying here is that you should only do something if you could make that a rule or a law and apply it to everyone. Kant also wanted to be impartial, right? He didn't want to just say you should do whatever you want to do, right? So this is easiest to understand if we evaluate something. Let's say that, well, now I have to think of something that isn't too terrible. So let's go with stealing again, but let's tell a story first. I'm very poor and I have half a dozen children. Not making fun of people who are in this situation at all. I'm very poor and I have half a dozen children. I have no source of food. I and my family are very hungry. In fact, we are starving. I see some food in a grocery bag next to a very well-dressed man who has a Cadillac or something, right? Let's just say he is obviously very well off. Is also very distracted. I realize I can grab the bag of food and run away, thus feeding my family. So, should I grab the bag? As we said before, utilitarianism says that we should grab the bag of food. He's a very well-dressed man. He's obviously well off. He's distracted. He's not going to beat me up, right? I can feed my family. Utilitarianism is going to say yes. Kant is going to say, well, I'm not particularly worried about your specific situation. This is the question we're trying to answer. Should I grab the bag? So we're going to strip this down. What I'm really asking here right? Let's put this in quote marks. Should I steal? Or maybe something like, is it morally okay to steal? But with a question mark. Okay, is it morally okay to steal? So now that we've stripped out the context, right? Because we want to be able to universalize it. We want to be able to make it impartial, right? We want to be able to make it universal law. We strip out all this hypothetical information and get down to the meat of the question. Is it morally okay to steal? Well, I'm going to act according to that rule by which, at the same time, I can want that it should become a universal law, which means that if I should imagine what would happen if everyone stole when, or no, just if everyone stole, right? Because we don't need any context to it. So I should imagine what if it were a moral rule that stealing was okay, right? That it becomes a universal law, not just a law for me, but a law for everyone. Well, this is really quickly going to lead to a situation where I grab the bag, and then somebody else grabs the bag from me, and then somebody grabs the bag from you or from them. Effectively, if we want to say stealing is permissible, then everyone is always okay to steal. Kant's going to say that this leads to absurdity. It leads to contradiction. You can't even manage to steal when nobody has any property, when it's just okay to take whatever you want. It becomes an incoherent concept. This also works famously well with lying, right? So I want $5, so I say I will pay you back, but have no intention of right? This situation, I want $5, so I say I will pay you back, but have no intention of paying you back. What I'm describing here is lying. Should I lie and say I will pay you back? We strip out all this stuff and get down to, should I lie? And then we put it into this little moral decoder ring, right? And say, well, to figure out if I should lie or not, I'm going to imagine that I want it to be universal law, that it's okay to lie. And I'm going to see pretty quickly that if everyone is always lying to everyone else, lying actually becomes impossible. No one would ever believe anyone, right? It becomes absurd. Kant is going to say it reduces to the absurd. So obviously, but if we put no in here, act only according to that rule or law by which, lying is morally wrong at all times, then we don't end up with something incoherent. We end up with people never lying, which doesn't contain any contradictions. Everybody's always telling the truth. It doesn't become self-defeating in that same way. Same with stealing. The idea of stealing becomes incoherent if we try to say that it should be universalized. Everyone should be able to do it all the time. But if we say that it's wrong, we see that actually we can apply that universally without much trouble, without any kind of contradiction. This is essentially all there is to Kantianism and deontology. There's more, but I don't think we need it to talk about these situations. If you're curious about this, if you're like, oh, that's me, I want rules, then let me know and I will give you some more resources. So we do have some interesting problems here. What if you are hiding a Jewish family in your attic during the Holocaust, right? As was the case with the story of Anne Frank. So, and a Nazi comes and knocks on your door and says, have you seen any Jewish people? Well, Kant's going to say, you can't lie. You should tell the Nazi, yep, there are some hiding in my attic. Or, according to Kant, you can also refuse to answer or try to argue with the Nazi. But it seems pretty apparent that this is going to be problematic. Essentially, you can just never lie under Kantianism, right? Because it is a rule. And if you were to just go off and apply partially to yourself what you wanted and not to other people, you wouldn't be acting morally anymore. So that's the thrust of it. And I don't know. Let's try to parse out what the problem with deontology is. First, uh, it really only works with a few things. Um, Lying and stealing. There are lots of other things that are we're going to want to say are wrong, but are not clearly all that wrong. For example, doing your homework, right? Um, if no one ever did their homework, then that doesn't lead to the absurd. It's just people would get zeros. Or if people only did the homework they wanted to do, well, lots of people want to do homework. So I'm not sure. It only really works with a few things. Um, in fact, lying and stealing are the examples that Kant gives um, when he lays out his ethical framework. It doesn't really necessarily work with other things. So the other thing is, it's going to lead to some really awful situations. For example, if visiting with a friend and a stranger comes to the door with a gun, then asks you where your friend is. Let's just say, so the stranger can kill him. You're going to have to Kant going to say you can either refuse to answer, or you can say my friend is sitting right inside. Um, you can't lie. So it's going to lead to some awful situations. Um, it's not hard to imagine circumstances where it seems like the right thing to do is going to be to lie. Or maybe in this example up here with the wealthy man and the grocery bag, your instinct was, of course you should steal to feed your family. Of course you should. Stealing is sometimes okay. You are probably not a Kantian. He's going to say you have to let your family starve or figure something else out. You cannot steal. So this might all be a little overwhelming, but I think this brings us to the end of our quick overview of normative ethics, with like a side of applied ethics, a side helping of applied ethics. So I'm going to leave you guys with a thought experiment that I really think teases out this distinction. Okay, so story time. Let's say that a man, we'll call him Joe, is a burglar. Joe has decided to rob an elderly woman's house when she goes to church on Sunday. So, on Sunday, he smashes in her window and climbs in her house. However, the elderly woman is not, I should say, at church. Instead, Joe sees her laying face down on the floor near the window. Now, to be very clear, his smashing in the window did not cause her, he didn't see her inside. They're unrelated. So Joe smashes the window, climbs inside. The lady is just laying there, face down on the floor near the window. This scares Joe because he's a burglar. He does not want to be accused of murder, so he runs away, taking nothing with him. As it happens, the elderly woman had a carbon monoxide leak in her house. This happens sometimes, y'all. It's a real thing. The leak had caused her to faint near the window. When Joe smashed the window, he let fresh air in and the carbon monoxide out. Thus, Joe's actions saved the elderly woman's life. Now, again, this is a thought experiment. I don't want to hear from you guys that this is ridiculous or would never happen. Don't try to break it. Genuinely think about this story, right? Joe had every intention of robbing this old lady while she was at church. He was going to rob her blind. He broke her window. He smashed her window, right? Um, the only reason he didn't rob her was because he didn't want to be accused of murder. He fully intended to rob her. He did not have any goodwill for her. He had no good intentions. He did nothing to help her that he was aware of. He just ran away, right? But by smashing her window, he saved her life. So what do we do with Joe? Do we give Joe a medal? Do we praise him? Did he do a good thing? Right? We're certainly glad Joe smashed the window, but it's not apparent that he did anything laudable or morally praiseworthy, right? So, the utilitarian's going to look at outcome. Well, and the utilitarianism is going to be forced to, or the utilitarian is going to be forced to say, Joe did a good thing. Whereas the deontologist is going to say, well, his whereas the deontologist or Kantian is going to say his intentions were to rob the elderly woman. He did a bad thing. He should be punished, even though he didn't take anything, even though he never actually got around to robbing her, right? And even though he incidentally saved her life. Because this really teases out the difference between these two views. Most people have some blend of these two views, and there are good reasons not to go with that, namely because they're not grounded in anything. Then you have no way to justify what you say is right and what you say is wrong. But then we're back to metaethics, and I don't want to record this lecture. My laptop battery is going dead. So this really, I want you guys to think about this problem for a while and what your gut instinct is, because this should go against all your instincts. I know it does for me. I know that if my utilitarian instincts are to say, well, of course we should look at outcomes. We can't ignore outcomes. That means that Joe did a really good thing. He saved this elderly woman's life. But then I also think, well, his intentions mattered. He wanted to rob her. He did a bad thing. Right? So ask yourself what we should do with Joe. Nothing, right? It's really difficult. This is not an easy situation. So I know I said I would try to avoid ridiculous thought experiments and talk more about applying these things to COVID-19, but we can do that with these same sorts of scenarios, right? Do we want to look at outcomes, or do we want to look at intentions? Right? Maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe I should change this. Were bad, right? His intentions were bad. So to contextualize this a little, because everybody wants it, and let me just say it makes me a little uncomfortable. So you guys are maybe I'm being a good utilitarian by doing what makes me uncomfortable and makes you guys more comfortable. When we see these people protesting the COVID-19 restrictions, we would do well to notice that these people are acting deontologically. they're maybe not according to Kant's deontological rules, but they're saying something like human beings have rights. You're denying me my rights. I didn't vote for this. They're making a principled stand based on rules, right? They're not worried about the outcome. They're not so much looking at the outcome of this. They're acting deontologically. They're saying there are certain principles that you just can't violate no matter what. I don't care what the outcome is, right? And then when people are like, I've seen this claim. I should have an I in there. I've seen people make a claim like this. People who don't wear masks and go to protests should be denied medical attention if they get sick. What they're doing is they're seeing these protesters as worsening the situation, as leading to a worse outcome. And eliminating them or denying them access to medical care, in this view, gives us a better utilitarian outcome. So I see this largely as a struggle between these two views. One that is based on principles, that looks at intentions and rights and doesn't really care about outcomes, right? A more Kantian perspective, in which case you're probably going to have a problem with the COVID-19 restrictions. You're probably going to say you can't treat people this way. What if we did this every time a virus broke out? What if we all just spent forever locked in our houses? What if we tried to universalize this, right? That's not an easy to dismiss position. It's a fundamentally deontological position. And those who see protesters as moral monsters see them as creating suffering and making everyone's lives worse. Which view is right? I really don't know. I'm not sure that a view is right. It's difficult to say, but I do think that until these two different views start talking to each other on each other's terms, until utilitarians start recognizing that they've got some deontologist in them, they have principles that they would never violate, and until deontologists realize that, they do care about outcome too. They would probably steal to feed their children. We're certainly not going to get any better. I can tell you that things like this are unhelpful. And if this protester said, they would, what? That's not one word. If this protester said, I don't care about your well-being, then they also would be being distinctly unhelpful. What we need is these two views. We need to recognize that these two views make up the vast majority of our ethical systems, and that there is a tension between them. We're going to encounter situations where it's not clear which perspective we should take. It simply isn't that easy. Ethics is hard. And that we need to find a way to reconcile these two perspectives. So, as silly as it might be to ask what should we do with Joe in this situation, I do think it has a bearing on what we're dealing with now, at least socially, if not governmentally as well. So, thank you guys. Hopefully that was satisfying. I realize that ending this class on the note of I don't know is maybe what you didn't want, but always understand that issues are more complex than any of us can know. People's motivations and goals are incredibly profoundly complex, and that very few people are sitting around just thinking to themselves, I want to do the exact wrong thing. Usually, some moral roadmap or some foundational moral principle is guiding them, and it's not necessarily so different from the moral principles that guide you. So thank y'all, and I hope to see you next semester in person. All right, bye.